There's a rule in the swamps of South Louisiana that has been passed down for a couple of hundred years, and it isn't about how to kill the monster, it's about what you do afterward. If you meet the Rougarou, the thing with a man's body and a wolf's head that walks the cane fields and the bayous at night, you don't run, you don't shoot it, you cut it, you draw its blood, and when you do, the curse lifts. The wolf falls away, and standing in front of you in the dark is a person, someone from your parish, probably someone you know. Then comes the actual rule: you can never tell anyone, not for a year and a day, not their name, not what you saw, not what happened out there in the water, because if you speak it out loud, the curse doesn't go back to them, it comes to you. Now, most monster stories are about the monster. This one isn't, and once you see what the Rougarou is actually built to do, who it was aimed at, and what it was protecting, it stops being a campfire story about a werewolf. It becomes something a lot more uncomfortable, because on the other side of the ocean, where this thing came from, the same idea wasn't folklore. It was a criminal charge, and people burned for it. Let's start with what people actually say they see. In Terrebonne Parish in Lafourche, around Houma, and the Bayou County south of New Orleans, the Rougarou is described in a way that's remarkably consistent. A body like a man, a head like a wolf, or sometimes a dog, red eyes, tall, always taller than it should be. It hunts at night. It moves through the sugarcane, along the water, and the edges of places where people live but don't quite go after dark. And the name itself is a clue. Before we get to anything else, Rougarou is a Louisiana French version of the word loup-garou, and loup-garou is one of my favorite pieces of accidental nonsense in any language. Loup is French for wolf, and garou comes down from an old Frankish word Werewolf, which means man-wolf, werewolf. So loup-garou translates roughly to wolf-werewolf. The word doubled up on itself somewhere in the last 1,000 years because at some point people forgot what the second half meant and stuck the wolf back on the front to be safe. That's not a small detail, that's a fossil. It tells you this word has been in people's mouths, changing shape for a very long time before it ever reached Louisiana. So the obvious question is, how did a medieval French word end up in the Louisiana swamp? The answer is one of the ugliest chapters in North American colonial history, and it's the reason Cajun Louisiana exists at all. In the early 1600s, French settlers built a colony on the Atlantic coast of what's now Nova Scotia, New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island. They called it Acadia. They farmed reclaimed marshland, and they were there for 150 years. Long enough to stop being French colonists and start being their own people, Acadians. Then, in 1755, the British, who by then controlled the region and were heading into another war with France, demanded an unconditional oath of loyalty. The Acadians had spent decades trying to stay neutral. Most refused. So the British deported them. It's called Le Grand Dérangement, the Great Upheaval. Over the following years, thousands of Acadians were rounded up, put on ships, and scattered. Families were split between vessels, villages were burned so there'd be nothing to come back to. People were dumped in ports along the American colonies. In England, in France, places that largely didn't want them. Thousands died of disease, exposure, and shipwreck. And a portion of the survivors, over the next decades, made their way to Louisiana, which at that point had passed to Spain, and which was willing to take French-speaking Catholic farmers. Acadian wore down in the mouth to Cadian, and in English to Cajun. Now, here's the part that matters for us. When people are driven out of a place with nothing, what they carry is language and story. The Acadians brought their French, an older, rural French, and they brought the things that the French frightened its children with, including the loup-garou. It came across the water in the same luggage as the songs and the prayers, and in Louisiana it had landed in a completely different world. Cypress swamp instead of tidal marsh, alligators instead of wolves, and it adapted. There aren't really wolves in the bayou, but the Rougarou didn't need them. It never had actually been about wolves. To understand what the Acadians were carrying, we have to go back to France before they ever left. And this is where the story stopped being fun. In the 1500s and the 1600s, France and its neighbors went through something historians sometimes call the werewolf trials. Not witch trials, though they do overlap. Trials where the accusation was, specifically, that a man had become a wolf and killed. These were real courts, real records, real executions. The best documented is Giles Garner, tried at Dole in the Franche-Comté in 1573. A hermit, poor, living outside town. Children in the area had been killed. Garnier was accused of doing it in the form of a wolf. Confessed, under torture, which is the detail that has to sit next to every one of these confessions, and was burned alive. There's Peter Stubb in Bedburg in Germany in 1589, executed with a cruelty I'm genuinely not going to describe. The pamphlet printed about his case sold across Europe, which tell you these stories traveled the way a viral video travels now. And there were many more. Estimates of the number of werewolf trials across France in this period run into the hundreds, and some scholars put the wider figure higher. The details are debated, the trials are not. Here's the thing to sit with. Something was killing children in some of these places. Wolves were a genuine danger in rural France. Real, documented, and we've sat with the worst example of it before around this fire. In Gévaudan, and sometimes the killer was a person, because sometimes it is. But the legal system of the time had a category ready. Not murderer, werewolf. And when your explanation for a dead child is that a neighbor turned into an animal, the person you burn is whoever the village had already decided to be afraid of. The outsider, the hermit, the one who lived alone at the edge. So when the Acadians boarded those ships, the Lougarou in their luggage wasn't a fairy tale about a monster. It was a memory of a thing they had to put people on trial for. Now let's come back to Louisiana, because here the Lougarou picks up a job it didn't have in France, and this is part of the legend that gives the whole thing away. The most widely repeated rule in Cajun tradition is this: if you break Lent 7 years in a row, you become the Rougarou. Sit with that for 1 second. Not if you murder someone, not if you make a pact with the devil, if you don't keep the fast, if you eat meat on the wrong Friday, 7 years running you turn into the thing in the cane field. That's not a monster story. That's an attendance policy. I want to be careful and honest here, because this is exactly where a lot of retellings get sloppy. How old that specific 7-year rule is in Louisiana tradition is genuinely hard to pin down. Cajun folklore was oral for a long time. The serious collecting happened late, and an enormous amount of what circulates online today about the Rougarou was written in the last 20 years by people copying each other. Some of the ancient tradition you'll read is younger than I am. What we can say with confidence is the shape of it. In a devoutly Catholic, French-speaking, largely rural community, spread thin across the bayou, often a long way from a priest, the Rougarou attaches itself to religious observance. The monster shows up exactly where the church's authority gets hardest to enforce in person. You don't need a priest in every village if every child in every village believes what happens to people who skip. Which brings us back to the rule from the beginning, the one about blood, and the year and a day of silence. Because as folklore mechanics go, it's beautiful, and I mean that with some unease. Draw the Rougarou's blood and the curse lifts. But now you're holding a secret about a specific person in your community, and if you say it out loud, the curse transfers to you. Look at what that rule actually does. First, it makes the legend impossible to disprove. Nobody can ever produce a witness. Anyone who says they met a Rougarou either can't name it, or, by the rules, is lying, because if they'd really met one, they'd know better than to talk. The story is sealed. There is no version of events where evidence can exist. Second, and this is the part I find genuinely unsettling, it turns the whole thing into a system for handling suspicion quietly. Think about a small, isolated community where somebody is off. Somebody drinks, somebody hurts people, somebody doesn't come to mass, doesn't fit, lives too far out. In a French village in 1573, that suspicion had a courtroom to go to, and the outcome was a fire. In a Louisiana bayou community, the Rougarou gives the same suspicion somewhere to go, and then clamps a lid on it. You may know, you may not say. I'm not going to tell you that the Acadians designed that deliberately, because nobody sat down and engineered a folk legend. But I point out that these are people whose grandparents were deported by an authority that didn't need much of an excuse. A story that says, keep your suspicions to yourself, is not a random thing for that community to keep. There's one more job the Rougarou does, and it's the most practical one. South Louisiana, before modern levees and roads, was genuinely dangerous, especially for a child. Bayous with no visible edge between land and water, mud that holds a foot, currents, cottonmouths, and alligators, which are not a metaphor. You could lose a kid in that landscape in about 90 seconds and never find them. Now, you can explain hydrology and the predator behavior to a 7-year-old, or you can say, don't go past the tree line after dark because the Rougarou is out there. One of those works, and I want to be clear that I don't think that's a con. That's a culture doing its job. Nearly every landscape that kills children has a monster standing in front of it. That's not a coincidence. That's the same solution being found over and over by people who need it to work tonight, not after a lecture. The Rougarou is a fence made of fear, because fear was the material they had. So we've got a monster that enforces the church calendar, absorbs suspicion about dangerous neighbors, and keeps children out of the water. That's 3 jobs, not a monster. That's infrastructure, which makes what happened next kind of wonderful. The Rougarou is still very much alive in South Louisiana, but it's changed employers. In Houma, in Terrebonne Parish, there's a Rougarou Fest, a full festival built around the legend, with costumes and parades and folklore, right in the heart of the country the story comes from. And the proceeds go to a wetlands education center. Think about the arc there, a monster invented, at least in part, to keep people out of the swamp now raises money to save the swamp, because South Louisiana is losing its coast. Land loss down there is measured in football fields per hour in some estimates. Subsidence, canals, sea level, the whole compounding mess. The wetlands the Rougarou was guarding are actually disappearing, for reasons that have nothing to do with anything supernatural. The fence outlived the thing it was fencing off, and then it turned around and started defending it. So, is there something in the cane fields? No. And I'd say that about most of what we cover here. And I'll keep saying it, because the honest version is always better than the version that flatters you. But here's what I'd rather you take away. The Rougarou is not a story about a wolf. It's a 200-year-old record of what a specific group of people were afraid of, written in the only medium they had. Fear of a landscape that took children, fear of neighbors you couldn't safely accuse, fear of a church whose reach ran out somewhere past the last house on the bayou, and underneath all of it, carried across an ocean in the hold of a deportation ship, the memory of a place where he became a wolf was something you could say in a courtroom and watch a man burn for. Giles Garnier was a real person. Whatever he did or didn't do, he died in a fire in 1573 because a legal system had a monster-shaped hole in it, and he fit. That's the thing worth being afraid of, not the shape in the sugarcane. The Rougarou never hurt anybody. The idea behind it killed people for 200 years. If you want the other side of that coin, the one where the wolf was real, and the bodies were real, and the killer was never satisfactorily identified, we already went there. And it's the darkest thing in French history that isn't a war. That's the beast of Gévaudan, and it's waiting for you. Keep the fire going, and I'll see you next time.